I'm going to overrule the objection, and the state can continue with their opening statement. Go ahead, Ms. McNeil.
So these 2002 images on the work computer, they're relevant because it shows that the defendant had an extensive collection of pornographic images that were categorized and were similar to the harassing images that were left around the Jensen residence over that period of time. And I describe those images for a reason, because they connect to these 2002 images found on the defendant's work computer. But that's in 2002. So let's talk about 1998. What you're going to see here is you're going to see an example of Julie's log, what she kept, what she hand wrote about this harassing activity. You'll see the date at the top there, January 19th of 1998, and what Julie Jensen described as new tactics live on the internet. And so she's describing this harassment that is apparently occurring now with a change of tactics over the internet. And then what I want to show you next is what is noted on April 13th of 1998. Julie Jensen notes in this log an email that's part of the harassment. Here's the email. You'll see that it's from someone by the name of Turtle, that's the name in the email, to Mark Jensen. And then you'll see in the text of the email, consistent with the harassment, here's a few for Jay, so Julie, of me soft. Also a shot I took without her knowing it of a married girl in the office I'm currently doing at a nearby hotel. Attached to this email are three pornographic images of nude males, and then what looks like a surreptitious image taken of a topless woman in a hotel room. And it's consistent with the harassment because here's this harasser suggesting essentially he's doing it to another woman, taking pictures of her secretly, which was the same implication given to Julie Jensen in the course of this harassment. And then also, again, of course, the pictures of a nude male. This email is from M. Jensen at execpc.com to M. Jensen at execpc.com, with the names changed. So the way you would see this email in 1998, it would just look like it's from an anonymous person named Turtle to Mark Jensen. But the way our computer analysts can see the email, our computer analysts can see who it's from. It's an email the defendant sent to himself, pretending, under disguise, to be, he's acting as the perpetrator of this harassment. So how do we know Mark Jensen is really the harasser? A variety of things, but this email proves it. Where else do we see the email? We see this same email address show up on the Jensen home computer. This email address, mjensen at execpc.com, is in the Jensen home computer under the name Mark Jensen. So this harassing, degrading email that's noted in Julie's log was sent by Mark Jensen to Mark Jensen under the guise of the harasser to be presented by the defendant to Julie as continued punishment for her affair, now years later in the spring of 1998. So that's the evidence that you're going to hear, that the first time the Jensen marriage was on the rocks in the early 1990s, that Julie Jensen sought counseling and treatment. She was treated for depression. She seriously contemplated divorce and even filed for divorce in 1991. In contrast, Mark Jensen engaged in a years-long covert campaign to harass and punish his wife. So let's turn to what's happening in 1998 when the Jensen marriage was again crumbling. In 1998, Mark Jensen had moved jobs. He was now working as a stockbroker at a company called Stiefel Nicholas. The home base for that company was in St. Louis. And working in St. Louis as an assistant to the defendant's boss was a woman by the name of Kelly Labonte. In this case, Kelly Labonte is sometimes referred to as the motive, because the defendant began having an affair with her in around September of 1998. And this was a very serious relationship, because shortly after Julie Jensen's death, just in the weeks after, Kelly Labonte would come to Pleasant Prairie to visit. She would stay at the defendant's house. Soon thereafter, she moved to Wisconsin. She remained in a relationship with the defendant for years after Julie's death. She married him. She had a child with him. And they were together until about 2009 when they divorced. And part of this evidence, an important part of this evidence, the computer evidence, right here, you can see in this picture in the back here, that's the home computer. A picture of the Jensen home computer in their home in 1998. And so because we're talking about 1998, we're talking about not a laptop or something mobile. We're talking about a desktop computer that has its own room in the Jensen residence. This isn't in a bedroom or a room that's occupied for people for other reasons. There's no TV. This is the computer room, essentially. And what you're going to see is that on this computer, after it was seized by the police, the day of Julie's death, on this computer, the police found emails between the defendant and Kelly Labonte. Now, these were work emails in the sense that what the defendant was doing is he was accessing his work emails from home, which now is pretty normal to do on your cell phone or on your laptop. But back then in 1998, with dial-up internet, that was pretty sophisticated. And you're going to hear the detective in that time frame didn't even fully understand it. How are these work emails on the home computer? But that's how they were accessed. And so the detective sees these work emails, but he sees they're not just emails between coworkers. These emails are full of sexual innuendo, and it's obvious that these people, during the fall of 1998, they were in a relationship. They were having an affair, because Kelly ended up getting married too in that time period. In fact, in one of these emails from October of 1998, the defendant refers to Kelly Labonte as his girlfriend. And they end the emails frequently, almost all the time, with IDLY. I do love you. So within a few months after Julie Jensen's death, the police are aware of this affair, the motive. And the detective sits down with the defendant in April of 1999, so a few months after Julie's death. And as this investigation is continuing, the detective, who has seen these emails, asks the defendant about Kelly Labonte. And the defendant lies. He says before Julie's death, they were just co-workers and friends. He had only seen her a few times. They weren't in a relationship. And even at that point, in the spring of 1999, he wouldn't describe them as dating. It's a lot of hemming and hawing about what he wanted to call them. And he certainly didn't want to admit to having this affair. Now, in this trial, I expect the undisputed evidence is going to show that the defendant was in the midst of an affair with Kelly Labonte when he killed his wife, Julie. Now, Julie was a perceptive person, and in the fall of 1998, she noticed changes in her husband. She knew that something was wrong. Something had changed after her husband had started this new job at Stiefel Nicholas. And she even suspected that maybe there was another woman, maybe her husband was having an affair. But the proof that the police had found was on the computer. And a critical part of the evidence that you're going to hear in this case is that Julie Jensen didn't know anything about computers. Now, nowadays, that sounds almost impossible in 2023, but life was different in 1998. People did exist without computers. They had grown up without computers. If you were an adult in 1998, you'd grown up without a computer. You started your work life, no computer. No one had these little computers in their pocket. And the internet itself was in its infancy. This is dial-up internet. You can probably hear it when I say the words, hear it yelling at you. And so what you're going to hear in this case is that this internet, this incredibly slow internet, this is something that Julie Jensen never used. You're going to hear that Julie Jensen didn't have an email address. There's no evidence of her sending an email. You'll see that this computer evidence, that computer in the Jensen home, the internet was only used on that computer during times when the defendant was home. And Julie was a stay-at-home mom, so she had access to this computer all day long. But the computer analysts can tell when the internet was being accessed, the times. And they can tell that when Julie's home alone, no one's using the internet. It's only when the defendant is home, late at night, the early morning hours, when it's used during the daytime, it's on a weekend. Those are the times the internet is being used on this computer. And you're going to hear that there's also several documented times when we know from the evidence the defendant was out of town. There's no internet usage during those times. Julie Jensen did not use the computer or the internet back in 1998 when that was actually possible. You're even going to hear an anecdote from Therese DeFazio. Remember, she's the third grade teacher. You're going to hear that when Julie Jensen came to her classroom and offered to volunteer, Therese DeFazio thought, oh, it might be helpful. Maybe Julie can help the kids in their computer lab. And so Therese DeFazio suggested that, and Julie was like, oh no, I don't even know how to turn on a computer. You know, Julie wanted to be helpful, but she told Therese DeFazio way back at the beginning of the school year, I really can't help with the computers. I can maybe type if someone opens a program for me, but that's it. So with proof of the defendant's affair being on the computer, Julie didn't have proof, only suspicions. She and her husband were arguing all the time, and she said when the defendant wasn't arguing with her, he basically didn't speak to her at all. Their relationship in 1998, that fall, was just falling apart. And once again, as in 1990, 1991, Julie was contemplating divorce. Now, during this time period, there were a few people that Julie Jensen confided in. Particularly, you're going to hear these names a lot, particularly her neighbors, Margaret and Ted Voigt. Now, I call them Julie's neighbors, but you're going to see in the evidence that they were really more than neighbors. They were friends. They had lived next to each other for years. The Voigts also had 2 children who were growing up. They both spent a lot of time outside. The Voigts' children would come over to play in the pool. They would see Julie outside all the time working on the garden. They would socialize with each other. They went out to dinners. They went to places like Six Flags with their kids. They went to the zoo or birthday parties. So they were friends. They were more than neighbors. In fact, you're going to hear in the evidence that Julie Jensen saw the Voigts so commonly that it was basically every day. Virtually every day, they'd see each other and chat with each other. So one day, about 5 or 6 weeks before Julie died, in about late October of 1998, Ted Voigt saw Julie Jensen in the front of her house. There was a bench there, and she was sitting there and she was crying. And Ted Voigt was getting ready for work that morning, but he saw his friend, his neighbor, crying. And so he went over to her. And this is the first of a series of conversations that Julie Jensen had with Ted Voigt about her concerns about her marriage and what was going on with the defendant. You'll hear about these conversations in detail in the evidence, but basically over the course of these 5 or 6 weeks before her death, Julie Jensen told Ted Voigt about the arguments with the defendant, how the defendant seemed changed, her worry that maybe the defendant was having an affair, and things that Julie had noticed with the defendant about the computer. She talked about going by the computer and seeing sticky notes that he had written by the computer that were suspicious, that had weird words on them like syringe and names of drugs. And she saw the defendant on the computer. For instance, she'd be vacuuming in the hall outside, and she saw on the screen that he was looking up poisoning and then closed the door in her face. She described another time when the defendant had gone to work but left the computer on, and on the screen there was a website about poisoning. So now, moving to late November, I'm going to put up here a calendar that'll help you with the days. Moving to late November in the days before Julie's death, which happened on December 3rd, Julie confided in Therese DeFazio. And this was the last time she saw Therese DeFazio. And you'll hear Ms. DeFazio recount this conversation and how she saw that Julie was troubled and encouraged Julie to speak to her. And Julie told Ms. DeFazio that she was afraid that her husband was going to kill her. Now, Ms. DeFazio was shocked and she was taken aback, and she asked Julie why she would think something so serious. And Julie explained about that list, that weird sticky note. And then she explained that she feared that her husband might try to kill her with a drug overdose and make it look like a suicide. Again, Ms. DeFazio asked her why she thought her husband might do this, and Julie said there were other things that she couldn't explain. And Julie confided to Ms. DeFazio, the same as she had to Mr. Voigt, that it bothered her how every time she walked by that computer room and the defendant was in it, he would cover it or turn it off quickly so she couldn't see the screen. And then there's a third person, the defendant's sister, Laura Koster. During Julie's life, Julie and Laura Koster were good friends. So even though Laura Koster is the defendant's sister, Julie confided in her as a friend. Julie Jensen spoke to the defendant's sister about the same suspicious note, the one that listed the syringe on it, and she even told the defendant's sister. She told her in the fall of 1998 that she feared that the defendant might be planning to kill her. Now, this sounds crazy, except for the fact that within a few weeks, within a few days of these conversations, Julie Jensen was dead. This sounds crazy. And that's the problem. That's the dilemma that Julie Jensen was facing. She knew it sounded crazy, and she explained it to Ted Voigt and to Therese DeFazio, that if she acted on these fears, if she did what a person who feared for their life would do, take her kids and run and hide, if she did those things, the defendant would point at her and call her crazy. Look at what my crazy wife did, running off with the kids, acting like I'm going to kill her. So here's what Ted Voigt said about Julie's dilemma. Ted Voigt said that her suspicions were that the defendant was trying to poison her, or he's trying to drive her nuts to take away the kids from her, because that's what the arguments that they used to have, that he was scaring her, that she was an unfit mother and he would take the kids away from her. Therese DeFazio said that Julie told her she stayed with her husband for the sake of the boys, whom she loved dearly, that she thought if she tried to leave her husband, he'd make up stories that she was unstable and that he'd get the kids. She didn't want to lose her boys. Another thing Julie had told Ms. DeFazio, going back to that prior counseling in 1990 and 1991, she had told Therese DeFazio during that counseling the defendant would always say things that were making her look like she was crazy. Remember, this is the man who for years tricked Julie into believing that her former lover was leaving debasing pornography all around when it was actually him. These days, we have a word for this. We call it gaslighting. So let's be clear. This isn't a case where it's either a homicide or a tragic suicide. It's either a homicide or a suicide plus. A suicide plus an evil plan to frame an innocent man. That way, the kids won't just lose their mom, they'll lose their dad too. There is one thing that is inescapably clear from the evidence, in spite of her fears that Julie expressed to multiple people before she died, Julie Jensen would not abandon her children. And so she stayed. Now, on Tuesday, December 1st, Julie Jensen went to see the family doctor, Dr. Borman. And during this visit, Julie told the doctor that she was miserable and depressed. So there it is, Julie Jensen talking about being depressed just days before her death. But she also told Dr. Borman that she and the defendant were having marital problems. She told him about the affair that she had and felt that the defendant never forgave her for. She told Dr. Borman that she's concerned her marriage might be over, and she told him several times that her kids meant everything to her. She denied being suicidal and talks about not wanting to lose her kids. And so we can see the parallels here to 1990. And Dr. Borman ends up referring her for counseling and giving her samples of Paxil, an antidepressant. One thing that you're going to hear in the evidence is before this visit to the doctor, the defendant was urging Julie to go see a doctor. So maybe he was just being a caring husband for his depressed wife. But this December 1st visit to the doctor was not enough for Mark Jensen, because the next day he went to Dr. Borman alone. This is December 2nd. And he didn't go for himself, he went for Julie. And he told Dr. Borman that he was concerned. He'd gotten some information off the internet about the side effects of Paxil, and he was concerned that Julie might be having side effects. And he was concerned because she wasn't sleeping. Now, this was odd because Dr. Borman made no note about sleep disturbances the prior day, which is a common question, a question that gets asked all the time when dealing with depression. A symptom being sleep disturbance is a very common symptom. Without seeing Julie Jensen, without trying to call her or consult with her, Dr. Borman gave the defendant a prescription for Julie for Ambien, 10 Ambien sleeping pills. So this was sometime during the morning of December 2nd, 1998. By the time of Julie's death, a bit over 24 hours later, 3 of those pills were gone.